Girl cuts her hair every time grandma babysits. Mom installs cameras. Sarah couldn't believe what she was seeing. Right from the beginning, she tried to tell herself that there must have been another explanation, that her mother-in-law would never do such a thing to her grandchild. But she could no longer ignore the facts. The evidence was right in front of her, and it clearly proved that her mother-in-law had ulterior motives. When Mia was born, her parents were incredibly overprotective. They'd been trying for a baby for years, and now that they finally had one, they wouldn't let anything happen to her. Because of that, they chose not to leave her in the hands of strangers and left her in the care of Christopher's mother instead. Was that really the best thing to do? Due to the nature of their work, Sarah and Christopher didn't really need a sitter. Sarah was a dispatch agent who mostly worked the night shift, and Christopher was a mortgage broker who usually worked during the day. So there was always someone with a baby, and she only needed a sitter when her parents chose to do something different, like go on a date. And that was where Grandma came in. But as Mia grew older, the times when a sitter was needed became few and far between. She would often go out with her parents, and Grandma only came around when Sarah had to work the day shift. At that point, everything seemed fine. Grandma didn't complain and little Mia seemed happy. But when she was about 3 years old, everything changed. It had been a hectic few months for Sarah and Christopher, so they decided to have an evening to themselves. They called Grandma and left Mia in her capable hands, not knowing what was about to happen. When the couple got home that night, Sarah wanted to check on her daughter and realized that her long golden locks were much shorter than they were earlier that day. Sarah ran her fingers through her daughter's hair, wondering what had happened to it. Judith didn't say anything about cutting her granddaughter's hair before she left. Sarah knew that a variety of things could have happened to lead to something like this, but all of those scenarios would have been logical, so why didn't her mother-in-law speak up? At 5 a.m. the next morning, Sarah received a text from her mother-in-law asking if she could babysit Mia again. Sarah found it odd since she was usually the one making the call. But that was just the beginning. Sarah explained they didn't need a sitter that day, and that was when a snowball effect was created. Judith started messaging her daily and every day with the same question. By the end of the week, Sarah was fed up with the request and decided to give in. She wanted a break anyway, and she could think of nothing better than spending some quality time with her husband. She left her little angel in the care of the grandmother, and the couple went out to spend a night on the town. If only they knew what they were in for. The couple had a blast, thinking that their daughter would be safe with her grandmother, but they were in for one heck of a surprise. When they got home that night, Sarah realized that Mia's hair was even shorter than it was before. It looked like it had been cut yet again. Who was doing it and why? The next morning, Sarah sat down with little Mia, hoping the child would give her some answers, but things didn't go as planned. As soon as Sarah mentioned Grandma, Mia's demeanor changed. She went from being happy and excited for the day to being sullen and distant. What on earth was going on? Why did her mood shift so quickly? The next few days went by and Sarah still didn't have any answers regarding the cutting of her daughter's hair. Mia refused to say anything and she knew she wouldn't get anything out of Judith, but then something completely unexpected happened. Judith contacted Sarah with a brilliant idea of booking a cabin getaway for the weekend. Of course, she'd be the one looking after the toddler. Sarah liked the idea of going away for the weekend, but leaving her child alone with Judith didn't sit well with her at all. She was starting to get suspicious of the woman and her motives for the visits. But she wasn't the only person involved in this decision. She needed to talk to Christopher and hear what he had to say about all this. That night, Sarah and Christopher sat down to talk about his mother's offer. Sarah made her fears clear, but it only caused a rift between them. Christopher accused Sarah of making things up because she didn't want Mia to spend time with her grandmother. Sarah tried to state her case, but she got nowhere, so she gave in and agreed to go away for the weekend. The weekend came and went, and on Sunday night, the couple arrived back home. Sarah was horrified to find that Mia's hair was cut again. When this all started, her hair was below her shoulder blades. Now her hair was a bob that barely reached the bottom of her ears. But that wasn't all she would discover that night. As Sarah leaned down to kiss her daughter's forehead, she stepped on something that was tucked in beneath the bed. She leaned down to see what it was, and what she found would leave her feeling even more confused than before. Why was there a toy truck hidden beneath her daughter's bed, and who put it there? Sarah was incredibly confused as she stumbled out of Mia's bedroom. The hair was something she wasn't willing to let go of, but this was downright confusing. What on earth was going on? Was Judith arranging playdates while they were gone? Is that why she didn't mention anything about Mia's hair getting shorter and shorter? Was someone else cutting it? Sarah was at her wit's end. All she wanted was to find out what was really happening while she was out spending time with her husband. She was sure she could deal with whatever it was that happened behind closed doors, but she never thought her mother-in-law's reasoning was as insane as it truly was. What was her mother-in-law actually up to? Even though Sarah tried her best to maintain her composure, she couldn't get herself to stop thinking about the situation she'd gotten caught up in. Her mind was constantly on her daughter and the events that had unfolded over the last few months. All she wanted to do was find out what was actually happening. Would she get her answers, or was she hoping for too much? Sarah had gone through countless sleepless nights as she tried to understand where she was standing. She wasn't only trying to figure out what was happening to her daughter, she was also trying to figure out if she would have her husband's support. Would he go up against his own mother if it had come down to that, or would Sarah be standing on her own? Even though those thoughts were plaguing Sarah, she had bigger things to focus on. She had to get to the bottom of this situation before she could point fingers. What was actually going on here? Was her mother-in-law to blame? Or was there something more sinister going on behind closed doors? Would the desperate mother find a way out? Sarah thought of every possible scenario, but she simply couldn't figure out what it was that is going on. It could have been a million different things, but she never thought of the true reason behind the disappearance of her daughter's hair. Not for a lack of trying, she was simply unaware of how far her mother-in-law was willing to go to get her way. Sarah spent countless hours thinking about what she was missing. Why wouldn't her mother-in-law just confess to whatever it was that was happening? Why was she trying to hide this even though she knew it would be impossible? Or was she even trying to hide it at all? Or was she just keeping quiet because Sarah was? It was yet another sleepless night for Sarah. She was tossing and turning as she tried to find a reasonable explanation for what was happening to her daughter while she was away. But she knew there was only so much she could do. The only way to find the truth was to catch her mother-in-law in the act, and to do that she'd need her husband's help. Would he agree? After the last argument she had with Christopher, Sarah wasn't too sure he would be willing to help her uncover the truth. He was very harsh the last time they spoke, and he did everything he could to protect his mother. Would he do the same this time around? Would he even believe a word she said, or was she just wasting her time? Sarah spent the next few days going over her options. The situation wasn't something that could be taken lightly. If she were going to go up against her mother-in-law, she'd have to do it the right way. Otherwise, she could end up losing everything. Was she willing to take the risk even though she wasn't sure if she was right or not? If she accused Judith of what she thought she had done, there would be no backing down. It'd be considered child endangerment to a degree and extent, and that wouldn't be good for her mother-in-law's reputation at all. But Sarah knew that without concrete evidence, it would be challenging to convince anyone, even her husband, of her suspicions. After much contemplation, Sarah realized that she needed to come up with a solid plan to catch her mother-in-law in the act. She couldn't simply accuse Judith without evidence, she needed something concrete to back up her suspicions. It was time to be stealthy and observant. Sarah decided to keep her mother-in-law at arm's length while she closely monitored Mia's interactions with her grandmother. She also decided to keep her phone close and record any conversations or interactions that might be incriminating. She felt a little guilty about spying on her mother-in-law, but her daughter's safety was her top priority. But each time there was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. Did Judith know that Sarah had been watching her every move? Sarah was being as careful as she could, but each time she was in the company of Judith and her daughter, it almost seemed like Judith made sure to be as normal as possible. It was like she was putting on an act. Sarah even caught her looking up at her suspiciously and then quickly looking down again. Judith was definitely up to something, but Sarah just couldn't put her finger on it. But her mother-in-law had always been open and honest with her. If there was something she was keeping from them, why was she not coming up to them directly to address the issue? Why all the secrecy? It was eating Sarah up inside. But how was she going to catch Judith in the act? She needed to come up with a solid plan to catch Judith of whatever she was doing. But as a mother, she knew she had to trust her instincts on this one. Something just didn't feel right to her. Was Sarah doing the right thing? And on top of all that, Sarah wasn't even sure if Judith was actually the one who was to blame for all this. For all she knew, Judith might have arranged playdates and it could have been another child who cut Mia's hair. Judith might have just tried to fix the damage by going a little shorter. If only she knew what she would find at the end of this treacherous road. Sarah tried her best to make her mother-in-law the good guy in this situation. She was convinced that Judith only had Mia's best interest at heart. That was the woman she knew after all, but her mother-in-law had secrets. There was something she hadn't told anyone, and it was the key to all the hair cutting. What was Grandma hiding? Sarah had always tried to be a good daughter-in-law, and because of that, she tried to think of any reasonable explanation so she wouldn't have to put the blame on Judith. She would blame anyone else if that meant that she got to keep a relationship with her child's grandmother, but she would change her tune once she found out what was actually happening. Sarah even went against herself and her own instincts. Even though she was having negative thoughts, she shut them down with the hopes there was another explanation. She'd never done such a thing before and she knew it was wrong, but deep down she still had a future, hope for a future where her daughter had a grandmother. That would change soon enough. But it didn't matter what Sarah did. She couldn't deny the fact that things were adding up. It didn't matter how many excuses she came up with, she couldn't believe them. There was no way she could deny the facts, and the facts were that if her mother-in-law were innocent, she would have spoken up already. With a heavy heart and a sense of dread, Sarah knew she had to confront Judith about what was happening. She couldn't let this go on any longer. She needed answers, even if they were painful to hear, but she also knew that confronting her mother-in-law could potentially strain their relationship and cause tension in the family. On a sunny afternoon, Sarah mustered up the courage and invited Judith over for coffee. As they sat down at the kitchen table, Sarah tried to keep her emotions in check and keep the conversation casual, but soon she just couldn't hold it in any longer. "Judith, I need to talk to you about something important," Sarah began, her voice trembling. "I've noticed Mia's hair getting shorter and shorter whenever you babysit. I just want to understand what's going on. Did you cut her hair?" Judith looked taken aback, her face showing a mix of surprise and discomfort. Oh, Sarah, you must be mistaken," she stammered. "I swear I haven't touched Mia's hair. Maybe she's doing it herself when you're not looking?" Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. She knew Mia was too young to be cutting her own hair, and the evidence pointed to Judith's involvement. Was Judith telling the truth? Despite Judith's denial, Sarah's gut told her something was amiss. Judith seemed way too uneasy when she brought up the subject. She seemed fidgety and wanted to quickly change topic. Sarah knew now that her mother-in-law was the culprit, but with still no evidence, she needed to come up with something fast. After a lengthy self-reflection, Sarah realized that there was no logical explanation for what was happening. There was no way her mother-in-law would be able to talk herself out of what was happening. No matter what happened, she was to blame because she was the one who was responsible for the little girl at the time. Sarah had known Judith for 7 years, and she was the kindest person she'd ever met. She never had to worry about her mother-in-law trying to break up her relationship or not liking her. Judith accepted her with open arms from the beginning, so was she really capable of doing such things to a child, to her own flesh and blood? The truth was that there was only one way to find out, and Sarah knew it. This would have to be done by her and her alone. No one else could get involved because they might end up ruining everything she was trying to achieve. If she wanted to win her husband over, she would need to present him with proof. Over the last few weeks, when Sarah tried to figure out what she was going to do, Judith kept pushing to take care of Mia. Sarah always came up with a reason as to why they didn't need her to come look after the toddler, but she felt bad about shutting the older woman down, not knowing it was the best thing she could have done. So Sarah decided to give Judith one last chance. Deep down, she still hoped she was overreacting and there was a logical explanation. But she was about to be in for one heck of a surprise, and it was enough to send her over the edge. What happened while Sarah was out having dinner with her loving husband? When Sarah and Christopher got home that night, their daughter's hair was completely shaved off. Sarah stared at her 3-year-old in horror as she tried to figure out what happened. But the moment she made eye contact with her mother-in-law, all her questions were answered. The smirk Judith gave her told her everything she needed to know. "Get out," was all Sarah managed to get out as fury engulfed her. Christopher tried to defend his mother, but Sarah gave him a look that had him swallowing his words. There was no way he could deny what was right in front of him. Every other time she accepted that he didn't see a difference in the length or that he thought it was cute, but this time things had gone too far. For months, Sarah had to take calls from teachers asking about what was happening with Mia and her hair. They asked her why her earrings had been removed and why her behavior had changed so suddenly. She tried to come up with every excuse in the book, but she was not willing to do it anymore. She was done protecting Judith and whatever it was she planned on doing. Sarah was so fed up that she didn't even bother listening to what Christopher had to say that night. She was out for revenge and she knew exactly how to get it. One way or another, she'd prove that she was right all along, and once she did, her husband would have no choice but to take her side. She'd start her quest by getting someone to install hidden cameras first thing in the morning. Even though Sarah kicked Judith out less than 3 days ago, she still had the audacity to send the seething mother a message. She was asking if she could babysit again, not knowing that she was playing right into Sarah's hands. This was her chance to get an answer, and she would not let it slip through her fingers. Sarah put on her best poker face and gladly accepted the offer. She told Judith she needed to work the day shift the next day and she would appreciate any help she could get. Of course, Judith was delighted by what she heard. She had no idea that she was about to walk into a trap that would expose her secret to the world. The next day, Sarah took her laptop and headed to a nearby coffee shop. She lied about having to work so she could get this moment alone, and she knew this case needed her full attention. So she put her headsets on and logged into the remote access port that linked her to the cameras. Something told Sarah that she needed to record this interaction, so she did, and she was right on time. Just as the device started recording the live stream, Judith said something that would answer all her questions. "Look at this hair," Judith said, running her fingers through the patch that was left on Mia's head. "People see this, they'll think you're a girl. We can't have that, can we?" Mia shook her head, but Sarah could see the fear in her eyes. Knowing that she had more than enough evidence now, Sarah sent the recording through to her husband. The message had barely left her screen when she received a call from him. "What on earth is that?" her husband shouted. "That's what your mother is doing to our daughter right now. Apparently having a grandchild isn't good enough. It's either a boy or it's nothing." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself despite her anger and hurt. "I can't believe she's doing this to our daughter, Christopher. This has to stop. It's not healthy for Mia and it's not fair to her," she replied, her voice firm. Christopher's tone softened as he realized the gravity of the situation. "I'll talk to her, Sarah. This has to end right now. It's not acceptable for her to manipulate our daughter's appearance like this," he said, determination in his voice. But Sarah knew that confronting Judith would be challenging, and she worried that her mother-in-law might try to turn Christopher against her. "Just be careful, Christopher. She may not take it well, and we need to stay united through this," she cautioned. As Christopher prepared to confront his mother, Sarah couldn't help but feel anxious about the upcoming confrontation. She had always hoped that she and her mother-in-law could have a close relationship, but now everything changed. The trust had been shattered, and Sarah couldn't overlook the emotional distress Judith caused her daughter. A few days later, Christopher sat down with his mother for a serious conversation. He calmly but firmly explained that her actions were unacceptable and that she needed to respect their decisions as Mia's parents. He also emphasized the emotional impact her behavior was having on Mia. Judith was defensive at first, denying any ill intentions and claiming she only wanted the best for her granddaughter. But as Christopher presented the evidence, including the recording Sarah had shared, Judith's facade began to crumble. She finally admitted that she had been trying to mold Mia's appearance to fit her own outdated and biased views. In the end, Judith apologized, but it was clear that the damage to their relationship was severe. Christopher made it clear that if she couldn't respect their boundaries and Mia's autonomy, their visits would be limited. He and Sarah knew that protecting their daughter's emotional well-being was their priority. The road to rebuilding trust with Judith would be long, and it would take time for her to fully understand the consequences of her actions. As months passed, Judith began to see the error of her ways and made efforts to change her behavior. She attended therapy to work through her biases and learned to accept Mia for who she was. Slowly, she started rebuilding her relationship with her son's family, and though it would never be the same, Sarah appreciated the effort. Through it all, Sarah learned the importance of standing up for her child and setting clear boundaries, even when it meant confronting someone she had trusted.